A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, back talking about those major developments this week in the Middle East, especially in the nation of Syria. And you may have picked up from our conversations earlier through this week, sounding the alarm bells that Christians are now in real danger in that region. Some of the most ancient Christian peoples are from that region. You may have been seeing the headlines about the fall of the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. An organisation that was formerly a franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria has taken control, and Christians have been fleeing for their lives. Bashar al-Assad and his family have been granted asylum in Russia. Well, our special guest is Elizabeth Kendal. She's had a long career as a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church, and she's back with us today. Elizabeth, a special welcome back to 2020.
And thank you for having me, Neil.
Elizabeth, first of all, let me ask you about the perilous danger that Christians are in right now, even as we speak, because this seems to be something overlooked in mainstream coverage of what's going on in Syria.
Okay, yes, well, on the 3rd of December, Catholic media put out a report from Aid to the Church in Need, which is a Catholic aid group, regarding Christians who had fled Aleppo. So, this is the 3rd of December, okay? So Aleppo fell into the hands of the rebels after only about 3 days on the 30th of November. And this is before Hama fell. Hama fell on the 5th of December, Damascus on the 7th of December. So this is after Aleppo fell, but before anything else. And the Aid to the Church in Need spoke to Father Jacques Morad, whose name instantly is familiar with me, having written so much on Syria. He had featured regularly in my writing during the Syrian civil war. He's the Catholic Archbishop of Homs, and he says that refugees from Aleppo had been fleeing into Homs after the rebel had invaded from Idlib into Aleppo. I mean, before the war started, back in 2011, Aleppo, particularly the western side of Aleppo, the side that faces Idlib, was about 10% Christian. That's roughly 200,000 Christians, and a very historic presence that goes right back to early church days. So it's really, really significant. Anyway, Father Jacques says that the people have arrived here. Many have travelled for 25 hours. They are thirsty, hungry, cold. They have nothing left. And it just brings back to my mind those pictures of the Christians fleeing from the Nineveh Plains in northern Iraq with nothing but the clothes on their back in 2014. So we're having seen a similar situation from Aleppo. And he says, and remember this is the 3rd of December, he says, the situation in Homs is very dangerous. Many refugees from Aleppo, including many Christians, came via the old road after days of attacks from the armed groups. We were not prepared for this. So we immediately held a meeting with the bishops and set up 2 reception centres with the help of the Jesuits. And then he mentions a couple of Catholic aid groups. He said, to help the refugees, we needed food, mattresses, blankets, and diesel fuel. And then he says, of course, all this suffering, immeasurable suffering, brings about many questions. And he goes through all the whys. Why? And there's this really sad line right at the end. He says, after the action of these armed groups, the Christians of Aleppo will be convinced they cannot stay in their city anymore. It's over for them, and they have no reason to stay. In Aleppo, they are trying to bring about the end of the rich, magnificent, and unique history of the Christians of Aleppo. It's over. And you just sort of think, it's so painful. And I sort of felt like when I wrote my book and it was published in 2016, there was this sense that, like, that the situation, as terrible as it was, the worst had been avoided and the situation had been saved. The Russian intervention had really saved Syria from descending into a hell like Libya and had preserved the Christian presence. But it's over.
It's over. And a new rebel leader seizing control, because there's still process that's going on there, Abu Muhammad al-Ghalani, leading the group HTS, a rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, formerly a franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria. The other day we were saying world leaders are all celebrating Al-Qaeda and the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, and we're wondering why that's the case with the history of Al-Qaeda the way that it is. Things are very confusing if you don't understand Islam. I want to get a focus on understanding the background here, Elizabeth. Very few have a grip on it the way that you do. I wonder if you can give us a bit of an insight here. How did we get here to this point as we look on those things that are unfolding right now in Syria?
Well, during World War One brought to an end to the Ottoman Empire, right? So the Turks had controlled the Ottoman Empire, which had been in existence for, several hundred years. And all of the Levant and Syria and the Holy Land and everything was under Turkish control. And if you've watched the movie Lawrence of Arabia, you'll remember that it was Lawrence of Arabia who convinced the Hashemite tribe of Arabs to fight with him to push the Turks out. And they pushed them up north of Damascus, and they met in Damascus. Now, the Allies actually offered the Hashemites a great big, like a mega caliphate in the Middle East. Then they realized that probably wasn't a great idea, so they broke it up. And some of the lands came under a British mandate, so Iraq and Jordan, and they got Hashemite kings to reward the Hashemite tribes. And then the Syria came under a French mandate. So they carved the Middle East in half, basically, through Syria and Iraq. And you might remember that back in 2014, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq bulldozed the border. And basically said there is no border between Syria and Iraq. They're returning it to its original state. It's known as Jazeera. So there's a real move of resistance against these colonial, Allied-imposed borders. But Syria was under a French mandate. And what France did was that it eliminated dhimitude. Now, dhimitude is that system where the non-Muslims they have the right to life, all right? So they're known as being protected because they're allowed to live. But in order to live, they have to live as second-class citizens. They have to live according to the Dhimma Pact. And that means that they have to be subjugated and humbled. Most seriously, they have no legal rights. So you can a dhimmi is not allowed to take a Muslim to court, which means a Muslim can rape any Christian woman he likes because she can't take him to court. Can loot and burn and loot any Christian home or village that they like. No Christian can take them to court. So that's a really serious thing for Christians. The other thing, Christians are not allowed to bear arms. So they have to be defenseless. And France said, no, this ends today. Under the French mandate, we have equalitaire, libertaire, egalitaire, all the French, words. Everyone will be equal. And so what the continuously persecuted and imperiled and impoverished and vulnerable Alawite community did, they would have been the most vulnerable in Syria because they're regarded as heretics by Muslims. They're like Baha'is and Ahmadiyas. They're regarded as heretics because they follow a later subsequent prophet. And what they did when they were given equality, was they just joined the military. It was a good job. They got to put on a uniform and stand up and be Syrian like other Syrians. And no one sort of really noticed that over the generations, the decades, the Alawites rose up through the military. And eventually it was Hafez al-Assad who became the president after the Alawites staged a military coup in 1963. So, yeah, that was just incredible. The French had gone by then, so the Alawites seized power to ensure that they would not be returned to that horrible situation of dimitude ever again.
Okay, so one of the developments you might expect under a new rebel leadership may be the return of that dimitude, and certainly the Alawites will be seen in a very, very low light. Of course, the Assads were Alawite. But what about this potential for a return of dimitude, a second-class citizenship? That's likely, do you think, under this supposedly more moderate but still very Islamic regime?
Well, I think it's absolutely guaranteed. I think Al-Giuliani is saying what he needs to say because he's smart, he's pragmatic, he knows how to play this game. He's promising, this is part of the Al-Qaeda strategy too. This is one of the things that separates Al-Qaeda from ISIS. ISIS was sort of like a bit wild, and Al-Qaeda is very intelligent, very strategic. I have always maintained Al-Qaeda was a bigger threat than ISIS. ISIS sort of essentially self-destructed, really. But Al-Qaeda is intelligent, strategic, pragmatic. So they will say what is the right thing to say. Al-Giuliani will say, we'll give all the Christians their equal rights to be Christians, but they will turn a blind eye. I guarantee it. And Muslims will take the law into their own hands. They will make sure Sharia is enforced and dimitude is enforced. This is exactly what happened with the Tazimet reforms that came in before World War One. So the British, before World War One, after the Crimean War, they said to the Ottoman Sultan, they said, we'll protect you, but you have to give rights to your minorities. So the Ottoman Sultan agreed to give rights to the minorities, and Muslims just went out and slaughtered them. And I think I said in my book they would rather slaughter the minorities than treat them as equals. And I'm absolutely certain that you'll see that.
And what do we make of reports that Alawite soldiers are being lynched in the streets even as we speak today?
Yes, I've seen those reports, and it doesn't surprise me one little bit. In Homs, I think it was an ISIS cell activated in Homs, has been pursuing Syrian soldiers, and they would be mostly Alawites, maybe some Christians, some moderate non-Islamist Muslims, and they've been lynching them in the street. So, and I saw that in Homs. Now that could be Homs province, which goes a reasonable way east in central Syria, out through Karyatan and Palmyra, that old historic Roman ruins area of Palmyra. I think I've seen mentioned, because the Syrian soldiers, the Alawites, are fleeing. The soldiers are fleeing towards Iraq, and I think they're being intercepted as they try to make their way through Homs towards Iraq. They're being intercepted, and I have a feeling I saw early this morning about a dozen had been lynched in the streets. They'd be brutal, absolutely horrible.
Elizabeth...
No, go on.
That's all right. I was going to say, pre-World War One, there was an Ottoman Empire. It was across that whole Middle East region. There was a breaking up of the Ottoman Empire post-World War One, and listeners will be very acutely aware our Anzacs were a part of those things that were going on in the Middle East at World War One. That's where the Anzac spirit comes from. But now we're returning to a similar sort of look to the Middle East post, like there was before World War One. How do you think things are developing there, and the way that Arab states might be cheering on or even be divided by this?
Oh, yes. Now, the Arab states, this is very, very interesting. The Arab states are not cheering this on. This is another fault line in Islam that a lot of people are not aware of. And that's like, so you've got the Persians and the Arabs. There's a fault line there, and they sort of hate each other. And then there's when the Sunnis and the Shiites plays out much the same on the same like ethnic fault line. There's also a pro and anti-Muslim Brotherhood fault line. So the Muslim Brotherhood claims to be a Sunni democracy, basically. So it's the old Sunni style where you elect a strong man and he looks after the state. And the Muslim Brotherhood has been a threat all across the Middle East for decades. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is diametrically opposed to monarchies. So all the Gulf monarchies are opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt is anti-Muslim Brotherhood under al-Sisi. You'll remember during the Arab Spring, which was really a Muslim Brotherhood event, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, and then the military took over from the Muslim Brotherhood. So al-Sisi is very anti-Muslim Brotherhood. They're the threat. They're the constant threat. And in the Gulf monarchies, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood is a perpetual existential threat. So there's a pro-Muslim Brotherhood fault line. And Turkey and Qatar are pro-Muslim Brotherhood, and the monarchies are anti-Muslim Brotherhood. So those monarchies, the anti-Muslim Brotherhood states, are rallying around Assad. I read a piece the other day that said some of these Arab leaders were hoping he would set up a government in exile. These Arab monarchies do not want to see the Muslim Brotherhood established in Damascus. And they do not want to see jihadists who might, decide that they need to overthrow the monarchies. And I think that I think we're going to see something. There seems to me to be real silence from the Arab states at the moment. Now, I'm just reading bits of analysis that I'm getting, but I'm not hearing anything really from the Arab states. But they're very, very concerned. So basically what they're seeing is a return to the Arab Spring, which was all sort of orchestrated and ridden by the Muslim Brotherhood to overthrow the monarchies and the Western-aligned powers. And I think there's a feeling that, we're right back to where we were in 2011 in Syria. We're back at the Arab Spring.
Well, our special guest is Elizabeth Kendal. She has a long career as a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church. More about the sorts of pressures that Christians are under as the new rebel leader, Abu Muhammad al-Ghalani, is assuming power, leading the group called HTS, a rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly a franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria. We're back with more after Vision National News. Our focus is on those developments in the Middle East, especially around the nation of Syria. You might be thinking all the focus of the world is on Israel and all of the battlefronts that it has, and this is the latest, an uprising in Syria that has overthrown the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. An organisation that was formerly a franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria has taken control. Our special guest is Elizabeth Kendal. She's got a long career as an advocate for the persecuted church. She's been a religious liberty analyst. Elizabeth, let me ask you about the Arab Spring that you mentioned, the potential for a new Arab Spring with the developments that are going on in Syria. Some are saying this is like a popular uprising, like the Arab Spring might have been back in Egypt, but does this look a little bit different to that?
Well, with the Arab Spring back in 2011, that was the narrative we were being sold, and it was not true. The narrative was that this is a popular uprising with people calling for human rights and democracy, but actually there was an element of that, but basically it was a Muslim Brotherhood orchestrated uprising. The Muslim Brotherhood rode and was going to ride it like a wave for regime change. If you think of Syria, back in December 2011, so this is when the Arab Spring was like hitting Syria, Qatar, which is a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, published the results of a YouGov poll that was commissioned by the pro-Muslim Brotherhood Qatar Foundation to demonstrate Arab support for regime change in Damascus. And while the poll did indeed show that the majority of Arabs wanted Assad removed, primarily because he's an Alawite and not a Sunni, it also showed that the majority of Syrians did not want him removed. The YouGov poll showed that 55% of Syrians do not want Assad to resign, and that 68% of Syrians disapproved of the Arab League's sanctions on their country. And this is unsurprising, because if you look at Syria, you've got a country that's 10% Alawite, so their lives will be existentially imperiled if the Muslim Brotherhood takes over. So 10% Alawite, 10% Christian. These are all people who like to live under a secular regime. They don't want to live under an Islamic regime. And then you've also got Druze, you've got some Shia, only a few percent Shia. And of all the Muslims you've got, probably a majority that have lived in Syria, which was a modern state, a secular state that you could take your family to for Christmas. Christmas in Damascus and Aleppo was just an absolute sensation. Christians could go on pilgrimage in the old city of Damascus and walk down Straight Street to the monastery that sits on the site of the home of Ananias, where Paul received his sight. So it's unsurprising that the majority of Syrians did not want regime change in Damascus. Now, the results were so embarrassing that they were only remained online for a very short time, and then what the Qatar Foundation did was they jiggled it. So they did the results by region, so that the Syrian results got connected with the Jordanians and the Iraqis, and they just got subsumed. But the fact of the matter is, Syrians do not want to live under an Islamic regime. They've lived in a secular, high degree of religious freedom, even if it didn't have political freedom. That could be, and that should be reasonably understandable in that region. They didn't want to go back in that direction. So when you see pictures of Syrians celebrating in the street that, an Al-Qaeda franchise has taken over the west of the country, it's not all Syrians. It's only those who want to live under Sharia, only those who want an Islamic Sunni-dominated state that are celebrating. The others are finding their papers and getting ready to flee and hoping they won't be killed in the process.
Elizabeth, so many of us will remember what was developing around 2014 and Iraq and throughout Syria, where ISIS was a real threat. And we might be thinking, whatever happened to ISIS? Because we're talking about Al-Qaeda here. We're talking about al-Assad, who survived the rise of ISIS, but now has fallen to this new regime. What do you think has happened? And is ISIS still a threat? Are there sleepers who are ready to emerge once again?
Oh, absolutely. There are sleeper cells in Iraq, and I've written on that. can't remember the locations, but there are sleeper cells. I think I looked at a map a couple of years ago. It was lower than Kurdistan and above Baghdad. There is some mountains, and there are a number of sleeper cells known to be there. In Syria, it's much, much worse, because Syria is where the last stand was, and Syria is where ISIS was really sort of birthed. That's when all the Islamists they had their little mini war, and Al Qaeda moved into Idlib, and ISIS took over Raqqa, and then moved across and made its caliphate. And then the last battle, of course, was on the Syrian side of the border. So in Iraq, Mosul was the last battle. In Syria, it was in Deir ez-Zor province near the border of Iraq, and that's where the last big battle was waged. Now, today, it's estimated today that there are about 9,000 ISIS fighters in prisons under Kurdish control in the northeast of Syria. So you think of the northeast, that's the area that we think of as Kurdistan or Rojava, I think they call it. It's contiguous to Nineveh province in northern Iraq. It's the Assyrian heartland, and which had its capital in Nineveh. Now, this northeast of Iraq and the east, so Hasaka province and Deir ez-Zor province, 9,000 fighters in prisons. Now, the Kurds have been straining under the pressure of it for years, because it's really, really a huge responsibility. It's a really big thing to keep all these fighters fed, locked up. They've had numerous attempts at jailbreaks, and they're trying to keep it. They're pleading for help. They're pleading for help in this, and they're just not getting it. There's about 2,500 fighters estimated to be at large in sleeper cells. That's a lot of fighters. But there's actually about 42,000 foreigners with links to ISIS in the camps, right? So camps like El Hol camp. Now, a lot of these are women and children, and a lot of those children are now teenagers. And I tell you what, if these prisons and these camps are liberated, or, there's a breakout, it's going to be all hell will just break loose, and ISIS will be back. And I feel like we're looking at the situation we looked at in 2015, where Al Qaeda was, looking to, move into northwest Syria, into Latakia, the Alawite homeland, and which would have been death for the Assad regime, and Al Qaeda and ISIS rather was on the doorstep of Damascus. And then the Russian intervention turned everything around. And I sort of feel like we could see ourselves in that sort of situation. So America has been bombing ISIS positions. America has bombed Deir ez-Zor city so that the Kurds could take control of it from the regime, from the Syrian government, so that it didn't fall into the hands of ISIS cells. And Israel has been bombing all sorts of Syrian military bases, military establishments. They've taken out the Navy and everything because they don't want it falling into the hands of Al Qaeda or of ISIS. So it's absolute hell. I think it's just an absolute disaster. And I do it, but ISIS is not the only. They're not the only really horrendous threat that Turkey actually carved out.
Let's talk about Turkey here, because there's a big and powerful nation in the mix we haven't been discussing, and Turkey, and if we're talking about Ottoman empires and such things and aspirations of President Erdogan, Turkey and the rumours, and it may be conspiracy theory, but I'll get your insight here insofar as the role that Turkey might be playing or even orchestrating from above. Any thoughts here?
Well, I believe that my personal feeling at the moment is that this has Turkish intelligence all over it. Turkey and Russia had come to an agreement concerning the militants in Idlib province. Right? Now, these are the Al-Qaeda militants. Although al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, when he was captured or killed by the Americans, he was in Idlib up near the Turkish border. So he was under Turkish protection there too. And I think the Turks might have handed him over, basically, betrayed him for some favour or other. But Turkey was the agreement between Turkey and Russia was that Turkey would keep the militants contained, and Russia sort of had other things to do and sort of sat around on a different sort of periphery. But they allowed Turkey to keep the militants contained. And, you know, there's pretty high levels of suspicion. It's right to be suspicious that the arms and the militants have just been flowing in, actually, I think. And I think with Russia, you know, tied up in Ukraine, I think there's been a massive intelligence failure. And I think that the arms and everything have just been flowing in to Idlib. But, you know, Turkey also, years back, carved out a huge section of northern Syria. So I can't remember how deep it is, but it's several, I can't remember, 50 more kilometres deep into Syria. They call it a buffer zone. And they were just going through there. And these are areas that it's a Kurdish area, but many, many Christians. This is really Christian heartland territory in the northeast of Syria. And so Turkey has controlled a huge strip of northern Syria for, you know, a decade now. And Gatestone Institute reported a week ago that there were messages coming in on X, right, formerly Twitter, saying that Turkish-backed jihadis were making Kurdish women available as sex slaves. And of course, we've seen this before, Turkish-backed jihadis just slaughtering Kurds and Christians in that area. And now apparently they said they will, or they are, or they will be offering Kurdish women as sex slaves. So it's very, very, very awful.
It's disturbing. Now, without Russia in the picture, because Russia appears to be, has been pushed out as a power broker too in Syria. What does that do for the Syrians? And maybe we might be focusing on minorities, and that includes the Christians. There are other minorities too, but without Russia in the mix, does that create even more concern?
I think it probably is pretty close to the end of the Christian presence in Syria, to be honest. I think what's going to happen, I think they've moved now, the Muslims moved now, Turkey moved now, because they believe that as soon as President Trump is in the White House, that he will broker a deal to end the war in Ukraine that would free Russia up. So they had to move before the 20th of January. So this was a well-planned event, and they went ahead with it. They've run through with it. But the interesting thing is going to be how the Gulf Arab states respond. That will be very interesting. Now, Russia is saying we cannot allow, I think you might have heard Lavrov say this, we cannot allow a terrorist organization to control Syria. We cannot allow that. So it might be slow. It might not happen until after Donald Trump is in office. Things have settled down maybe a bit in Ukraine. I don't know. But we might see a bit of an alliance maybe between the Arab Egypt and the Arab monarchies, who are US allies, and allied with Israel as well, I might add, or were with the Abraham Accords before everything started to fall apart, working maybe with the US and even with Russia to make sure that we don't have a terrorist organisation running Damascus and controlling much of Syria. So they might be looking to, to put in a Sunni regime. I don't think we're going to get, well, we won't, I believe. We won't get a secular, we won't get what we had, a secular, minority-ruled Arab nationalist Syria back again. I think that era might be gone, and I think Syria might be carved up into cantons, but it's never going to go back to what it was through the 20th century.
When we talk about a potential new Arab Spring, that means a whole new war, doesn't it? And there'll be obviously big losers. And coming back to those Christian minorities once again that we'll often talk about as the persecuted church, a whole new war in Syria, which, if this doesn't look like a war already, but this has a potential to deepen, do you think?
Oh, yes, I think it does, especially if Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and possibly Jordan and UAE, if they decide to enter to kick, to kick the Muslim Brotherhood-backed Islamists out of Damascus, yeah, that could become, almost like a world war type of thing, a really big regional war. And, they might be able to push the Islamists out of Damascus. They might have a big war for much of Syria, but the Christians are going to be the losers no matter what happens. I think they're in a really, really, really diabolical situation. They were a remnant anyway, and I think they're now just, it's like I read that article before, that they feel like it's over for them.
And Elizabeth, so far as fleeing refugees, we might remember that there were those who were seeking sanctuary and flooding across borders and filling refugee camps and looking for asylum in places like Australia. Do you think this might be ahead of us for 2025?
Yes, I'm almost at a loss to know where Christians are going to flee to. They're going to flee to little pockets. I mean, a long time ago when the jihadists moved into various parts of Aleppo, Christians fled to Latakia, which is the northwesternmost province of Syria, on the coast there. That's where Russia has its base and its port, and that's the Alawite heartland. And, thousands of Armenians flooded in there. And where do you go now? I mean, if the jihadists move into Latakia, where do you go? The Syrian Navy has been bombed. And the soldiers have fled. The Russians, I don't know if they've got ships there. I don't know if they can. I don't know if they can move people out of Latakia. I don't know. I just don't know how this is going to unfold. And as for Christians in Damascus, where are they going to go? They're going to try and go over the mountains into Lebanon? I just don't know. And I really, really hope that our government can make a case that the minorities of Syria need to be rescued. And that's a topic for a whole other issue. The betrayal by the West of the indigenous Assyrian and Armenian peoples. They were promised. They fought with the Allies in World War I, basically putting their own lives at risk. They fought with the Allies. The Allies promised them a state and then broke their promise and left them to be slaughtered, which they were. They were slaughtered in Iraq, especially in the Semil massacre, the year after the British left. And so we have betrayed them over and over. Are we going to actually try and rescue the Christians, the Assyrian and Armenian Christians of Syria today? I really pray that we do.
And there are obviously prayer points, a call to prayer. Very quickly, how would believers pray for the situation that has developed in Syria, and recognising just how serious it is? A thought or two, Elizabeth, just around how we might pray.
Well, Christians are fleeing to little safe pockets. They'd be fleeing to possibly monasteries in cities like Homs. These are very big cities. They'd be in monasteries, or maybe still many in their homes in Aleppo. And I just think I just pray that God would send his heavenly hosts, his angelic forces to surround them, to keep them safe, to guide them if they need to flee, to be like that pillar of cloud, that pillar of fire, and guide them to safety, and to preserve them and to help them to put their trust in him and to follow him as he leads them. And to pray that Western governments will actually really believe that we have a responsibility to help our co-religionists, the ones who we promised we would help when they were our allies in World War I, that we have a moral duty to them. That would be a great revelation, if our politicians and American politicians as well would actually have that revelation and maybe do all in their power to rescue Assyrians and Armenians as they're fleeing the country.
Well, Elizabeth, a beautiful opportunity to discover a little more about what's going on in the Middle East, because understanding the history helps you understand things that are going on in the present. And the book you wrote, which is more specifically about what's going on in the history of the Middle East, after Saturday comes Sunday, understanding the Christian crisis in the Middle East. And listeners might also keep an eye out for your first book, which was Turn Back the Battle. Isaiah speaks to Christians today. And for listeners to connect with Elizabeth, she has a website, elizabethkendal.com. Not as much detail as we used to see from Elizabeth, but there's no doubt opportunity to connect on some of these levels, understanding what's developing in Syria. elizabethkendal.com. Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing your heart and your appreciation of that history with us today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.